pozdravljeni. Zelo sem vesela, da začenjamo novo rundo oziroma nov semester Maskinega seminarja sodobno-medicinskih umetnosti. I'm going to switch to English because we have Martina with us. I'm really happy that today Martina Ruhsam is joining us. She came all the way from Frankfurt with train, so I think that it was a long way, but
a nice one.
But a nice one. Yeah. Martina Ruhsam actually is a very good friend of Maska and of us because she also attended Maska seminar and worked for the Maska seminar in the past. Now she's living in Frankfurt and she made her PhD with Bojana Kunst in Giza. So I'm very glad that she's here with us today. She's very much involved with new materialisms in contemporary performing arts, and today she's going to present a lecture on autonomous will of things. So, Martina, please.
Yeah, thank you, Pia, Alia, Rok, for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. And it's awaking a lot of memories and very good memories. So I'm very happy to be able to share my thoughts in this context of the seminar and with you here. Even if somehow in these days it seems difficult to discuss or to reflect about something different than the war in Ukraine, but we will try. Yeah. Before I will start with my lecture, I wanted to make some preliminary remarks about the orientation of my research, so to contextualize it a little bit. Pia has already mentioned that I wrote a PhD on the topic of non-human bodies in contemporary performances, or more specifically, I was somehow doing research about the relation of human and non-human bodies in recent performances, primarily in choreographic works, but in performances in general. And when doing that, I focused very much on, because non-human things can be many things, can be technologies, can be animals, can be other things, and I focused very much on like everyday items and not on animals, plants, or technologies. And to be even more specific, I was very curious how in recent performances artists deal with old things, with used items which are actually out of fashion, with discarded things, with waste and garbage, with remains. So I wanted to somehow investigate how in performances the relationship between the human body and the more than human world is thematized. But I was looking specifically for works in which things would not be involved for the purpose of optimizing or enhancing the human body. So I was not really doing research about the involvement of new technologies. This would rather be the research field connected to the questions of transhumanism very often. So in transhumanism, the question is very much how non-human things and technologies enhance the capabilities of the human body. Whereas transhumanism adheres to a modernist conception of time that associates the future with progress and the continuous optimization of human beings, the retrieval of old, broken, discarded things and remains of processes of production is linked to a temporality which is contrary not only to this modernist idea of progress, but also to the way of dealing with time and materiality as it is promoted by the capitalist modus operandi. In philosophy, things and objects have very often been described or discussed as prostheses or as extensions of the human body. But I was looking for a less anthropocentric way of looking at the relationship of non-human bodies and human bodies. And in the works that I chose to discuss in my book, artists are somehow turning towards the material remnants of another time, in which they do not recognize lifeless debris, but actants that may outlive the human beings dealing with them. The artists somehow stress the material liveliness, the agency, and the partial autonomy of things that do not fit into the grid of economic profitability. And as Maria Puig de la Bella Casa has aptly written, in an utterly precarious, more than human world, life in the 21st century is more than ever dependent on human care and a speculative ethical imagination. And I think this sort of speculative and ethical imagination is something that I found and discovered in these artistic works that I also want to talk about today. So in the first part of the lecture, I will more focus on some theoretical concepts from new materialism, and in the second part, I will discuss specific artistic works. I have observed in my research, and probably you have observed it as well, that both in the performing arts and in theory, there has been an intensified engagement with things and non-humans, in some countries more, in some countries less. And it's interesting that in northern European countries, this somehow engagement with the non-human or post-humanism is the strongest. In the performing arts, I recognized this engagement, especially since 2008, and in philosophy, approximately since the second millennium. So attempts to include things or non-humans into performances have, of course, always existed. But in recent years, many choreographers have experimented with things and have tried to perceive them as co-performers rather than as props. They have highlighted how humans choreograph things and are at the same time choreographed by them. The performance theorist André Lepecki has formulated this shift of perspective when he wrote about the performance of the choreographer João Fialdeiro, and he wrote, I quote him, "In this properly set up world where objects have been replaced back to their functional positions to perform their utilitarian purposes, we see how a whole system of objects invades, takes possession, and defines the very core of subjectivity. We see that the systematicity of this system choreographs to the minutest detail, even at the level of desire, the subject who is supposedly controlling this system." End of quote. So many of the post-humanist performances have invited us to perceive and to sense a certain reciprocity in the relationship of persons and things. They addressed questions such as, how do things induce certain movements or actions? And how do they induce specific social choreographies? In how far are human bodies implicated in the biographies of things and in their afterlife, after the short time span of their consumption? And how could we perceive things not only as passive objects, but rather as vessels of potential actions? What is proposed in many of these artistic works and concepts is a sort of posthumanist perspective. So instead of presenting the human subject as the exclusive locus of agency and as the sole initiator of actions, they foreground the performativity of things and non-humans in their affordance. So affordance is their capability to suggest certain movements or actions or to alter them. The existence and availability of certain things always co-determines and also differs human actions. This is a point that the sociologist Bruno Latour has made in many of his writings, already in the late 1980s, in which he claimed that even in social theory, it is important to abandon a mode of thinking that is exclusively concerned with human beings, intentions, and societies. In the 1990s, Latour and his colleagues outlined in what was later called actor network theory that human beings constantly form associations with various things and non-humans that are crucial for the social cohesion, and that actions are always compound, so meaning that they involve various humans and non-humans. It was Latour who promoted research in this direction and who somehow paved the way for an even more radical rethinking of the status of things and objects after the second millennium. And this is when new philosophical movements emerged, such as speculative realism or object-oriented ontology, new materialism, and others. That all have developed very different concepts, but they all have in common that they try to rethink the role of things or of non-humans within philosophy. However, Latour was somehow still trapped in the logic of addition, making long lists of those actors and actants, that's how he calls the non-human actors, that would be involved in a certain action on every occasion. Karen Barat, an American philosopher, developed a theory called Agential Realism, and that's like one line of thought within new materialism, that in my opinion goes beyond this logic of additions and associations. She takes the conceptualization of a posthumanist performativity one step further. Not only does Barat emphasize that the border between the human and the non-human is always already a result of political practices. And this is totally evident if we just think about the time of slavery, for instance, when people from certain geographical contexts were actually treated like objects and could become the property of their colonizers. According to Agential Realism, it is not only associations of humans and non-humans that act. Humans and non-humans are themselves products of their encounters, exchanges, and interpenetrations. I will come back to this later. In posthumanist performances, even non-humans are taken into account with their agential capacities. Instead of reconfirming the human as the only locus of agency, they aim to compose assemblages, situations, experiments in which diverse actors and actants coincide and all have somehow the possibility to change the situation. According to new materialism, one cannot know what a body is capable of, because one cannot know which entanglements it will enter. Karen Barat shifts our attention to the very materiality of bodies, or to put it more aptly, to processes of materialization. She investigates the entanglements of humans and non-humans, but also of nature and culture, of matter and meaning. For her, the materiality of bodies, no matter how human or non-human they are, is actively involved in processes of the production and reproduction of the world. Barat is not thinking in terms of associations that we form with things, but in terms of entanglements that make us who we are. With every breath, we inhale a mixture of nature and culture. The interpenetration of residues and human bodies is the ecological condition. As soon as we see or touch something, we are entangled with complex assemblages, mixtures of nature and techniques, materiality and discourse, consolidations of capitalism and its refractions. The most important concept in Karen Barat's Agential Realism is the concept that she calls Intra-Action, and that probably some of you already know. So simply put, an intra-action is an encounter of different entities, human and or non-human, after which none of the involved will be the same that it has been before. So other than in a classical interaction, when subjects and other subjects or objects come together and exchange, whereby these roles are kept in place, Barat claims that subjects and objects are actually the results of their encounters, the results of intra-actions. So in strictly philosophical terms, one could say that she claims that there is no existence of relata prior to their relations. And even the boundary between subjects and object is not an eternal or given boundary, but also this boundary is somehow drawn again in every new interaction, and therefore is always up to negotiations and political practices. The crucial point now for Barat is that agency for her is not an attribute of subjects and not of objects or of whomever. So agency, she's writing, is not something that someone or something has, but agency is what emerges in an interaction. It's a matter of interactions. And therefore the question is also not if now in times of post-humanist discourses, human beings also ascribe a certain agency to things and non-humans, because this would actually be a very anthropocentric move. But agency is what somehow results from these encounters and interactions of involving humans and non-humans. So in this way, Barat tries to detach the notion of agency from its traditional humanistic reference. And like Bruno Latour and other proponents of actor network theory, and like some other materialists, she does not consider agency to be synonymous with subjectivity or intentionality. Barat was or is actually a natural scientist, so she did her PhD in quantum physics, and later on she dealt mainly with philosophy and feminist theory. So in a way she is queer in that sense that that she is thinking with and through the humanities by using terms from and concepts from physics, or she's like thinking transversal to these two categories of the natural sciences and the humanities. And this is what she would call a diffraction or a diffractive reading. So the reading of one discipline through another. In Barat's intra-actions, the boundaries and the properties of the involved are and destabilized, which as a consequence makes them exist as such in the first place, and which means that the involved in an interaction, no matter how human or not, do not possess any stable identity or attributes. So that means that this concept of interactions is in complete opposition to any form of metaphysical individualism and to every theoretical approach that starts from the assumption of enclosed entities with stable attributes. So this would, for example, be the position of object-oriented ontology. So her theory, Agential Realism, is in a way diametrically opposed to object-oriented ontology. Because in object-oriented ontology, the question, first of all, is what an object is and what it is independently of the human being and regardless of its relations. Whereas in Agential Realism, it is all about these relations. The strictly relational ontology of Karim Barat shows parallels to Latour's understanding of translation and to his definition of a political ecology. A political ecology is, as Latour explains, not concerned with shifting the attention from the human being to the pole of nature. Anyway, for Latour, there is nothing like nature. That's why he always writes about what was formerly called nature, because nature is already a product of the interaction of humans and non-humans that somehow made certain phenomena appear and others disappear. But it is about taking the risky entanglements of diverse human and non-human entities seriously. I quote Latour, "Political ecology shifts the certainty in the production of objects without risk, with their clear distinction between humans and things, to the uncertainty about their respective relationships and their unexpected consequences, which may influence all the governings, plans, and effects." For Barat, even a measurement in physics, so in the laboratory, is an intra-action and not an objective assessment of the qualities of a certain thing that would somehow exist prior to the process of measuring. She insists that as soon as one makes an assertion about a thing in physics, one necessarily has to take the measuring devices, the experimental setup, as well as the observers into consideration as well. And she's coming to this claim by referring to quantum field theory and especially to the writings of Niels Bohr, who gave evidence of the fact that there is no outside world that one could clearly be separated from, or that one could look at from an allegedly objective position. As one of the founders of quantum physics, Bohr showed that measurements are not independent from the measuring apparatus and the measuring persons. On the contrary, the act of measuring is but one potent moment in the construction of scientific knowledge. This is now more relevant for physics, but that's where Barat draws her theory from. According to Bohr, one can only speak about phenomena in physics, and the phenomenon is the totality of the observed and the apparatus of observation, which includes material, semiotic apparatuses, persons, technologies. And Karen Barat develops these thoughts further and insists on the interwovenness of practices of knowing and practices of being. For her, this cannot be separated from each other. And that's why she also sometimes calls her theory an ontoepistemology. But yeah, instead of continuing now to talk about agential realism in this abstract way, I would like to think with it now by looking at a concrete artistic work. First of all, I would like to talk about a project with the title Rare Earthenware. It's a work by a research and design collective that is called Unknown Fields Division and that is based in London. And the collective is investigating the consequences of recently developing ecological and technological scenarios. So in the last 15 years, Unknown Fields Division realized numerous expeditions on almost all continents. Their works are almost always based on a specific journey. And Rare Earthenware was developed in 2014 following a trip to China. During the expedition to China, the artists aimed to trace the history of electronic devices such as laptops or smartphones. So they wanted to track their process of production and fabrication until the very beginnings in a Chinese mine in Batu. Why in this mine? Because in Batu, an industrial city in the north of China, this is the location of the biggest refinery for rare earth metals worldwide. And rare earth metals, you probably know, are crucial components of almost all high-end electronic devices. So every smartphone, for example, contains components of about 8 different rare earths, but laptops and iPods contain even more. And somewhat paradoxically, quite big quantities of rare earths, especially neodymium, is also needed for the production of electric cars. Waste products and residues of neodymium extraction are not only toxic, but contain traces of radioactive substances like uranium and thorium. The extraction of 1 ton of rare earths produces about 1 ton of slightly radioactive mud. And these residues that are produced in the mine are then pumped into huge lakes in the north of China. And due to lacking environmental regulations in China, they often seep into the groundwater, which of course has then severe consequences for the whole region. The collective wanted to visit this mine site, but they did not get access to the mine legally. So that's why they used strategies of investigative journalism, and they pretended to be interested investors and purchasers, potential purchasers of the mine. As such, they were allowed to visit the mine site, where they also filmed with hidden cameras, but of course these areas with the black radioactive lakes was not shown to them. But nevertheless, with the help of GPS and satellite images, the members of the collective managed to find the road that is leading to these lakes. And when the security guards changed shifts, they managed to enter this area and without being noticed in order to make videos, to take photos and to collect some of these radioactive remains. After this trip, they developed an artistic work in response to this journey and to this experience at the mine. And the artistic work is consisting of, on the one hand, 3 vases that they sculpted, and on the other hand, a short film. And these 2 things are always exhibited together. So they always present the sculptures together with the film that I will show later. I can also show a picture now. Here you can see the there's no image. Here you can see the 3 sculptures that they made. And these 3 vases are like modeled after traditional Chinese Ming vases, and they are made from this radioactive mud that they collected there, and that remains as a residue when rare earth elements are mined, that are needed for the fabrication of 1 smartphone, this is the smallest vase, 1 laptop, that's the middle one, and 1 electric car. This is the amount of residues that remains when the rare earths are mined for an electric car. So each vase is somehow representing the amount of mud that remains as a byproduct in the fabrication of these products. But the word representing is inappropriate here, because the vases do not represent the mud, they consist of it. So the vases are material discursive hybrids that are active in myriads and in risky ways. They are active not only in a semiotic sense, but also materially. They are the result of specific intra-actions. The encounter of artists from London and radioactive remains in China. The material itself, the mud, this is how they collected the mud, is already a product of an interaction as well. An interaction involving Chinese industrials, workers, technologies, and stones. To use a term of Karen Barat, the vases are the congealed agency. And the mud they are made from is, to quote her, like the sedimenting historicity of practices. The radioactivity of the vases is not higher than what is allowed to be exhibited in a museum, but in bigger quantities it could have severe consequences for human and other organisms. In the short film Rare Earthenware, one can see several stations of the cultural biography of the vases that Anon Fields fabricated in reverse. The film shows what is largely disappearing from view in a European or American context: the industrial production of things that the average European depends on in order to be occupied with what was called immaterial work, which is actually very much dependent on specific materials. Profit without production is the motto of European enterprises that outsource industrial processes of production to low-wage countries, mostly in Asia, in order to specialize themselves on advertising campaigns, public relations, marketing strategies, services, research, logistics, etc. More and more often, the subject is not fabricating things in these contexts. It is the subject itself that is increasingly becoming the product of its own work. Modes of capitalist exploitation in post-Fordism are less linked with reification than with a certain de-reification. Donna Haraway has emphasized the nexus of inheritance and embodiment when posing the question, in how many ways do we inherit in the flesh the turbulent history of modern capitalism? In regard to the radioactive lakescape that is developing in China, this question gains an utterly concrete meaning. Toxic lakes are a paradigmatic new materiality or hyper-object with which we will have to deal in the future. The landscape developing in the north of China at the intersection of terraforming and material autonomy is the material backbone of our digital culture. As remote as this place may seem, it is intimately interwoven with the daily practices of an urban population in Europe. And I would like to show you the short film now, which is about 6 minutes. Yeah, what I find very fascinating in this work is that it somehow shows also so aptly that the mud from which these vases are made are not cannot be simply seen as a resource for human constructions, or as a passive matter that is just waiting for cultural inscriptions, but the material, the mud itself, is very much also actually the topic of this work, and is active by itself. And also the cameras with which Unknown Fields was filming in the mine, also the cameras are not neutral instruments. The cameras are actually materially entangled with what is recorded by them. So paradoxically, the collective is actually depending on exactly those items whose genealogies they critically trace. So the cameras the collective was filming with in the mine and the laptop on which they edited the film material are signified by exactly these histories that the film depicts. Also, they could contain rare earth elements that were mined in the in Batu that they recorded. So, in that sense, the artwork also shows very well for me that there is no outside position they could take, and that they could look at these phenomena. They are implicated in this whole phenomenon. They are part of it. And in that sense, the film is also not a representation of the world or of a phenomenon that would not have consequences for the latter, but the film is much more a constructed approach to the world with very concrete material and semiotic effects. And now I would like to talk about a completely different work, a performance with the title Oblivion by a Belgian artist called Sarah van Haye. Oblivion means like something forgotten, and the performance premiered in 2015. And Sarah van Haye developed it out of a sort of self-experiment. For 1 year, Sarah van Haye inverted her socially and culturally conditioned relationship with waste. She was collecting, cleaning, and archiving her rubbish in order to develop an artistic work exclusively from those things that she would usually throw away. She was taking pictures of her biological waste that she did not archive, but she retained items, packaging material, but also immaterial waste like notes, texts, and emails that she would normally discard or dismiss. In the performance Oblivion, picture, one can see 46 cardboard boxes filled with these waste materials that she collected for 1 year, standing on the right side of the stage. And for the entire duration of the performance, about 2 hours, Sarah van Haye is unpacking these boxes, placing every item carefully on the floor, while she is speaking a long monologue that she composed of these notes and messages that she would usually throw away. After having worked outside of theater institutions for some time, the artist asked herself if she could not convey what would normally be kept outside of the regime of the visible into the theater. Oblivion is a sort of a celebration or an act of retrieval. By touching every single waste product, Sarah Van Haye celebrates her garbage that is slowly filling the entire stage. Paradoxically, this does not induce disgust. The colorful assemblage of waste is not smelling and is aesthetically rather appealing. The plastic bottles are gleaming in the spotlight and are rather evoking associations linked to the hygienic obsessions of the Western society in the 21st century. The tableau of waste that is appearing looks like a dump, which is the result of a profound purgation or cleaning, while processes of decay and putrefaction take place elsewhere. For André Lepecki, goods are characterized by their ontological reduction to their utility function. That's how he defines the difference between things and goods. Only after having been discarded, Lepecki claims, goods can become things again. As waste, they are worthless for capitalism and thereby regain their endless potentiality. And the cultural theorist Tadeusz Slavek writes, I quote him, "At the dump, among spoilage, we can find the possibility of the outside of the system, which supposedly has incorporated everything, including these forces which were to subvert it. If there is an outside to capitalism, it is located in a litter bin." End of quote. In these quotations by Lepecki, that I just read, Lepecki and Slavek express the desire to perceive products of waste as the ultimate dissidents of value-added economy. But in fact, in the 21st century, the transportation, the storage, and the recycling of waste products is a very lucrative business, which is increasingly managed by private corporations and which is very much based on the ideology of added value. Until 2018, a huge amount of plastic waste produced in Europe was sold to China. In 2016, China imported 7.3 million tons of garbage from various countries in the world. Only in 2018, China decided to stop importing plastic waste from foreign countries. And now I would like to show you a short fragment from the performance Oblivion.
Each fraction is a mixture of different hydrocarbon chains which differ in terms of size and structure of their molecules. One of these fractions, naphtha, is a crucial element in the production of plastics. There are two major processes to produce plastics: polymerization and polycondensation, each requiring different catalysts. Plastics can be grouped into two major families: thermoplastics and thermosets. Earthenware on my right hand is a thermoplastic called polyethylene terephthalate. It consists of long polymerized units of monomer ethylene terephthalate with repeating C10H8O4 units. Its main raw materials are purified terephthalic acid, PTA, case number 1210. Dimethyl terephthalate, DNT, case number 1616. And monoethylene a polymer of high molecular weight and catalyst is needed. The most common catalyst is antimony trioxide. This is only the beginning of the beginning of the beginning of the production of our friend. Altogether, producing one plastic bottle requires 10 million kilojoules. 10 million kilojoules for one plastic bottle. 10 million kilojoules in my right hand versus 0 kilojoule for the source water. 10 million kilojoules versus 0 kilojoule, 10 million kilojoules versus 0 kilojoules. Of course, I choose you, my lot in the lottery, my silver mine, my gold shipping company, my energy bomb, my capital generator, my flux creator, my world traveler. You were traveling with tanker from the depths of the Atlantic Ocean and the coasts of Nigeria, via pipelines, trucks, and trains, all the way to a huge factory in New Delhi, India, via the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, close to Albania, arriving by ship in Tunisia, following the large roads, and then the narrow cuts to Parma, leaving Italy again, taking the highways of the European mainland to the storage space in Antwerp, and then to the shop in Brussels, where I found you. From there, I took you to Lancaster, to Berlin, to Strasbourg, to Paris, to Frankfurt, to Gothenburg, to Groningen, to Brussels, to Ghent, now we are in Ostend. After our tour, we will start traveling again. We don't know yet where. Maybe all the way to China, where a beautiful little girl will pick you up with her slender little fingers and sell you to the factory for instance. Or maybe you stay in Europe to work on your transformation. Or maybe you go back to the Pacific to serve the race. You've been through so many minds and hands, no matter what race, age, class, or level of education. You're part of my powerhouse, my energy field, my spontaneous diet. You, marvel of science, you're the prodigy of networking. You are my hope for the future. We are your land, your soil, your soul.
And one more scene later on.
So
For the soundscape, she was collaborating with two musicians that she asked to compose a soundtrack for the last part of the performance with musical found footage that they associate with waste. And it's mainly consisting of hip-hop songs. Alma Söderberg was making it. Yeah, and now I still wanted to talk about a third performance, but I'm not sure if I'm already too late in time or if I should skip the third performance and jump to the end. What do you think? Or I make it very short, the third performance. Okay. That's the last performance I will talk about, actually a performance installation. Maybe some of you have even seen it because it was presented in Ljubljana once in the frame of the Mladi Levi Festival. And that's the performance installation Work Table from Kate Mcintosh. Work Table was first realized in 2011 and it is touring in all kinds of countries ever since. In the installation, one person at a time can enter the performance installation, which consists of 4 rooms. In the first room, there is a huge shelf with all kinds of everyday objects that all seem to be a bit old and outdated, like the things that you can see here on this image. So old-fashioned ice skates, worn-out teddy bears, cooking spoons, etc. When standing in front of this shelf, one is asked to choose one of these objects that one will have to dismantle or deconstruct later on. That's all the information one gets. So with one chosen object in one's hands, one is then guided to the second room, in which there is an instruction on the wall that says, please take apart, shatter, or wear to pieces your chosen item. In order to do that, there are all kinds of instruments in the room. There are hammers, scissors, knives, a saw, a face shield. When finished, one should put the item pieces on a tray and transport them to the next room. So in this second room, everyone is alone. There is nobody who watches this kind of action. So one is only somehow interacting with all these devices and instruments that are available there. And that's how the objects look when they leave the second room. And how they are brought to the third space. In the third space, one is supposed to take the tray of another person and to rebuild the object that another person has taken apart. This work in the third space is done in the company of other participants who are also sitting there at various tables reconstructing an object in pieces. And eventually the reconstructed objects are brought to the last room where the repaired items are kind of placed or exhibited on various shelves. These are some examples. In Work Table, Kate Mcintosh breaks with several conventions that are significant for contemporary performances. Not only is there no separation between performers and spectators, there are no performers at all. At least no human performers. In but moreover, in the installation, no one is acting for the gazes of others. And at the same time, there is nobody who is exclusively observing what others are doing. So the participants are all the time somehow part of a constructed situation that they continuously alter and observe at the same time. So again, I see here very much what Karen Barat describes in her theory, that there is no outside position, there is no position from which one could watch what is happening in the installation, but all the time one is part of this phenomenon that one can observe while being an actor within it. The performance installation induces a choreographed interaction of various subjects and things. And the artistic work itself, so the installation itself, is an interaction between the dispositive of the theater institution or the festival in which it is realized, the experimental setup by Kate Mcintosh, and the participants. Both the participating persons and the things that are part of the installation. If the performance installation would, for example, be realized in the context of visual arts in a museum, for example, the reconstruction of objects, I am convinced, would be interpreted in a very different way. And it would much more be read or understood as somehow the fabrication of little artworks or something like that. But in the context of the performing arts, the installation somehow unfolds its subversive potential and allows one to perceive objects as kind of crystallized actions. Kate Mcintosh said to me in an interview about this work, I quote her, "I think because you have just been through a long process with your own object, you become sensitized to read the actions in the other objects, rather than to focusing on the aesthetics." So to come to an end with my lecture, I consider, by somehow borrowing the terminology of Karen Barat, I consider choreography and performance making as embodied ways of thinking that practice material entanglements and interactions, that initiate and that investigate the latter, and that thereby temporarily reconfigure the world. So performances are not representations, it's a reconfiguration. I see a lot of political potential in the concept of interaction, not only in regard to feminist debates, but also in regard to the development of a political ecology and a different approach to artistic practices. Barat somehow succeeded in deconstructing the notion of ontology as something given and therefore as a sort of destiny. She outlined it as an effect of the very specific interactions of human and non-human, meaning organic, technological, discursive, and textual entities. Thereby, she unveiled the political dimension of ontology. Emphasizing the mutual dependencies and entanglements of human and non-human bodies in a world that prioritizes autonomy and self-subsistence is, in my opinion, already a political project. Maybe the awareness about these mutual dependencies and the crucial role of interactions involving more than humans can help us to challenge neoliberal appropriations of responsibility as invulnerable and irresponsive self-mastery. I hope for a certain repoliticization of the relations of humans and non-humans and for the development of a new understanding of ecology. An ecology that is not busy with the preservation of nature. Anyhow, there is just nature culture, but that is concerned with the entanglements of ecology, economy, and socio-cultural developments. I agree with Crystal Stalpert when she says that posthumanism requires a fundamental rethinking of all aspects pertaining to the performing arts. It raises the question what it could mean that performances and performance practices become ecological. It opens up the question if the anthropocentric dispositive of the theatre is the appropriate home for artistic works in the future. It raises the question that Rebecca Schneider posed. If all matter is life, and therefore life is not only implicit in human beings, animals, and plants, but also in all things, what then is life art? It raises the question of care in regard to entangled ecologies. Political ecology does not neglect human individuals and bodies, but it doesn't start from these bodies, but from the awareness of more than human interactions. Thank you.
Yes. So thank you very much.
Sorry, can I ask? Yeah, thank you. Because nice. I couldn't see you at all. It's nice to see you.
Without the lights, it's very
yes.
So thank you very much for this. I enjoyed it. I have several questions though.
That's
some
very
are
good.
Terminological, some are more kind of conceptual. So the first terminological question would be, do you distinguish between a thing and a non-human? Because these are the terms that you've used several times. And I just want to know if this is something that you just use interchangeably.
Mm-hmm.
And also, this is more common, I see a potential problem for both of these terms. One is that if you see the world as composed of humans and non-humans, you can hardly argue that this is not an anthropocentric position, right? And the problem with the term thing is, of course, that a thing, at least etymologically, is the same as a matter of thinking, right? It's the same in German, denk and ding. Kind of one and the same thing. So whenever you have a thing, it's a thing of thinking. The quintessential human capacity. So I don't know if these are really the terms that would move us towards a post-humanist perspective. So this is a kind of critical question.
Mm-hmm.
And then my really critical question would be, how do you distinguish the work of Barat to say the work of phenomenologists of the early 20th century? Like, how do you separate, I quote, relata do not exist prior to the relationship? How do you say that's not already Edmund Husserl?
Mm-hmm.
And you've used the term phenomenon quite a lot. So what is the added value to phenomenology, which basically states all the things that you've highlighted as, contemporary philosophers have decided that this is something new. But the Germans and the Jewy Germans have already discussed that 100 years ago. And Heidegger as well was an anti-humanist. So I suppose my next question would be, how do you distinguish between post-humanism of the Nordic Europe from anti-humanism of the Germans and of the French in the 20th century?
Mm-hmm.
So many questions.
Many questions.
Many questions.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you for these questions. I hope I remember one by one now. Otherwise, please help me. It was a lot of them. So I will start with the very first question concerning the terms of non-humans and things. So in this lecture, I actually use these terms interchangeably. and in the book that I wrote, I really focused on artistic works that deal with things. But that was not a conceptual decision. That was a pragmatic and a decision that was more based on the fact that there were PhDs at the same time written on the role of animals on stage, for instance, or of plants. So I wanted to find a specific focus and also focus on specific artworks that deal with everyday items. So that was not a conceptual decision in that sense. But in my writings, I then rather tried to also discuss or to differentiate between the notion of things, objects, and goods. So how these three notions actually depict very different things. But about the notion of non-humans, I have to say I didn't question that notion that much.
Well, I mean, if you just have humans and non-humans, I would argue that's a very anthropocentric perspective.
An anthropocentric perspective in the sense that this is two categories that are made
based
by
on whether you're a human or not.
Well, I would not totally agree. I mean, if we would take that argument, then whichever notion would be anthropocentric, because notions are invented by humans. And things or plants do not propose different notions. But so I think inventing notions on concepts is, and also theatrical practices, performances, these are very humanistic practices. But I don't agree that the notions human and non-human would already in a way point to an anthropocentric direction. So what I was trying very much is for instance to show and to describe how already the human body of a human is very much an entanglement of human and non-human elements. So how we can even perceive our own body as an interaction of the organic and the inorganic, of things that we would call part of the human organism, but there are also bacteria and fungi, there are also artificial organs, etc., that are all part of the body. And in that sense, we can even look at the human body as an interaction already that would not be able to survive if it would not interact with non-humans. So in that sense, for me, this is not necessarily pointing to an anthropocentric future. Or
but then how do you differentiate that position from phenomenology?
That's a very, very good question that I directly addressed in my research, because there are many points that were already made, for example, by Merleau-Ponty, and that one can find again in the writings of Karen Barat, but there are very crucial differences. So I cannot now deeply go into the comparing phenomenology with agential realism, but one difference is that in phenomenology, the claim or the big discovery was that they looked at how the body is embedded in the world, in the life world. But Karen Barat would say, so in a way it was about how not only to look at subjects, but to look at the subject embedded in a certain environment, including non-humans, things, etc. And Heidegger wrote essays and pages about things and how we interact with things that are really interesting and partly very close to what Barat is writing. But Karen Barat would, for instance, say it is not about how we are embedded in a certain life world, how the human subject and body is in the world, but it is about how the human body is like made and part of this world, not only placed in it, but how we are of the world. And that's might sound like a tiny shift, but then in her theory, it has major consequences. And it leads to a different direction than when the phenomenologists discussed it. And one huge difference is also that if one goes through the texts of the phenomenologists, the way how they write about the world is very much that there is the subject, which is placed in a certain life world, but the world is stable. It is
I think
there.
you read too much Merleau-Ponty.
For him, at least, this is very strong. So there is a certain understanding of a stability of the outside world that Karen Barat would never go with.
The world doesn't exist outside of the subject, within the world. So,
but then there are also more like differentiations between the notion of the phenomenon in phenomenology and in agential realism. These are not exactly the same concepts that are behind, but this would now, I think.
Right. I'm happy with the answers. Thank you very much.
Martina, thank you. Thank you for the lecture. And I would maybe first ask one question related to this three concepts, thing, good, object. And I'm really curious how did you relate, and maybe I would bring the question of value, because you quoted Lepecki, how the goods turn into things, and I'm not sure, especially when it comes to art, that this process stops, you know, that it can actually, the examples that you are giving are turning things again into goods, very special goods, very special objects with very special value in artistic context. So this would be one question, and the other example, maybe you know the movie Wasteland about the Brazilian photographer, by project of a Brazilian photographer who actually approached 6 people working in the biggest waste or recycling depot near Rio de Janeiro, asking them to make portraits of themselves out of garbage that they collect on a daily basis. And he photographed them from in a kind of storage from a bird's perspective, and then sold those portraits in one of the Sotheby auctions in London. And some of the people who were working in this depot went there and were fascinated by how easy, you know, people throw 30,000 pounds for photography. But what was, and the movie is really great because it brings again and again ethical questions of relation between a photographer and people who work there. But what was also like very instructive or manipulative or touchy, take it whatever way you want, is that some people who all got money, 30,000 or even more of pounds, went back. They say, this is my place. I don't want to start a new life. My life is here with the waste. So they established more like some kind of ties and relation. There is more than just, I don't know, doing job. Which, anyway, I would, if you can comment.
Yeah, I saw the movie. It's fascinating. Yes. This differentiation of things, goods, and objects. This is very much what is proposed by André Lepecki, and his definition of goods that I quoted, and also based on this definition, he somehow wish that goods and objects might become things again, and I think that's what he would wish for the performing arts. Is something that I wanted to criticize a bit. So also that idea that when goods are thrown away, that this would be the moment they become things again, is, I think, in my opinion, a bit problematic, because also as waste, they are not outside of these cycles of added value. But what I find somehow helpful is the distinction that he opened up between things and objects, and that's also what others philosophers did, like Jane Bennett, for example, proposes the same distinction between things and objects, and that's that somehow that objects are things that are only relevant because of their the function that they perform for a human subject. So in a way, the only relation to an object is a relation of instrumentality between the subject and this object, whereas a thing would be relevant beyond this function that it performs for the utility it has. And in that sense, the thing would be somehow transversal to this dichotomy of subject and object. So this differentiation I find somehow helpful, but I would question very much the claim that, as you also brought it up now, I would not agree with that in the performing arts it's about uncovering the thingness of goods again. I think this is hardly possible, and I don't think that this is the direction, and that's also not what is the case in the works that I talked about today.
Thank you, Martina, for your lecture. It was great. I really enjoyed it. I have two questions. So one is more out of curiosity. I was wondering if you, when you analyze these artworks, but also others, if also these artists themselves refer to the theories that you're talking about, because I think a lot of this, from my very modest impression, a lot of these theories also have become quite, so artists have become also interested in them. So I was wondering if this relationship also goes the other way around. This is just kind of a curiosity thing. And the second question that I have is related to what you mentioned at the end. These kind of questions that you opened, which I found really interesting. And I was thinking, I think you said something like, how does performance become ecological? Does it need to somehow also transcend this kind of framework, I think, of theater and so on. And I was thinking, if you encountered artists that also thought about this question more explicitly or reflected it in their work. What I mean is, because I think there is a very interesting tension between that has been touched upon also, that between, let's say, the dispositive of art or theater, performance, but also visual art, whatever kind of context, which is, I find it difficult not to see it as a kind of also, in certain sense, humanist or anthropocentric, if you want, in this kind of in this kind of theoretical context, dispositive, because it is. I mean, even if we don't have performers or division between, there's always an artist or a collective with a certain intention, to put something on display or whatever, to create an experience for someone who then experiences it and so on. And so, this kind of tension between the, let's say, intentionality of art or performance and this kind of post-humanist, let's say, theory and working, and I see it in the examples that you gave, like trying to kind of undo this barrier between who is looking and who is doing and so on. But I don't know, I was just thinking if you also analyzed some performances that dealt with that, or if you were thinking about this, because I think it's really interesting tension.
So I very much had the same question as you, the first one that you mentioned, when I discovered artistic works that I found fascinating to this topic. I was very curious if the artists were inspired by these new philosophical movements, or if they know about them at all, or if they are not interested. And I cannot give a general answer because it was very different from case to case, but I really talked with all of them. And there are various artists that have absolutely no idea of these philosophical movements and have never read any of these texts. There are others who are very much interested in them, but I sometimes also realized that sometimes it's a very superficial reading of these theories, where then several notions are picked out and are played with, and this interest is usually then was mostly more into object-oriented ontology. I didn't meet until in the recent 2 years, I didn't meet anyone who was interested in Agential Realism or in Karen Barat. From Sarah van Haye, for instance, I know that she was familiar with object-oriented ontology, and she was interested in it. The second question is a very big question for me at the moment, and this is actually where I would like to go to now with my research. And that's why I planned somehow as the next research project to conduct interviews with 50 artists who were dealing with this question in order to discuss with them what for them it would mean if a performance practice would become ecological, both in a speculative way but also in a referring to the experiences they have already made and concerning the pragmatic organization of their everyday life and work. There are few projects that I know that really experimented with somehow, how to call it, questioning the theater dispositive by itself also. So one project would be, for instance, from Stefanie Wenner, the series Apparatus, that she realized in a space in Berlin that was not a theater, that didn't have a stage, that didn't have any fixed positions for audience members, that didn't have tickets, where there was no entrance fees, but where there was a program also including performances for 10 days that people from the neighborhood or whoever was interested could come and join for whichever duration you would want to. And you could watch in whatever way you would choose, because there was no kind of predefined setup like in theater that would suggest a certain position of viewing. And the space also contained mushrooms and different kinds of non-human actors that transformed the space over time. So this is one project that really tried to rethink the apparatus of theater. And another project that I know is one experiment where Patrick Fourreau, he's called, he tried to make a performance in a container in which actually he tried to produce interactions with plants. And there was never a performance to be watched, but for him the performance was what was happening in this container over the duration of 2 months. But then there were also some moments where specific events happened in this container, but actually he perceived the performance as like what was going on there during the 2 months. That's another example now that comes to my mind. Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Or of course, otherwise we can also continue in a more informal way outside. But if there is any other comments.
Thank you, Martina. That's really nice.